Here's a sentence that sounds like it shouldn't be true. At some point in the last few tens of thousands of years, the human brain got smaller. Somewhere around 10% of its volume gone. Line up a skull from an Ice Age human next to a modern one, and the ancient one is noticeably bigger. We're talking about losing roughly the volume of a tennis ball off the top of the most complex object we know of in the universe. For millions of years, the story of the human brain only moved one direction, and that's the version most of us grew up hearing. Bigger brain, smarter species, more tools, more art, more everything. Then, somewhere along the way, it reversed. And scientists still don't agree on when this happened, why it happened, or whether it even means anything bad. So I went looking for the answer. What I found instead was a live scientific argument. Researchers publicly contradicting each other. So let's go through it properly. Who are the suspects? First, the boring explanation, because it deserves a fair hearing. Brains don't exist in isolation. Bigger bodies generally need bigger brains just to run them, more muscle to coordinate, more sensory surface area to process. So the simplest idea is that human bodies got smaller after the Ice Age, likely as diets shifted with the spread of farming, and the brain just came along for the ride. No mystery, no decline in thinking, just proportional scaling. But the brain is an outrageously expensive organ to run. Despite being a small fraction of your total body weight, it eats up a hugely disproportionate share of your daily energy budget just sitting there thinking. Researchers Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler proposed something called the expensive tissue hypothesis to explain how humans could afford such a costly brain in the first place. Their answer: something else in the body had to get cheaper to compensate. And the organ that shrank to pay for it was the gut. As human diets shifted toward higher quality, easier to digest food, our digestive tracts could get smaller, freeing up energy that got redirected toward this incredibly expensive brain. So if energy is the whole story, and diets shifted again later in different directions, could the reverse have happened too? A body reallocating energy away from the brain this time. It's a clean, physiological explanation. The problem is, when researchers actually test brain shrinkage against body size changes in the data, the drop in brain size looks bigger than body size alone can explain. So something else is happening. Here's an idea that a lot of serious researchers take seriously, and it still catches people off guard the first time they hear it. Humans may have domesticated themselves. Look at almost any domesticated animal next to its wild ancestor. A dog next to a wolf. A farm fox next to a wild fox. There's a repeating pattern across totally unrelated species. Smaller skulls, smaller teeth, softer and more youthful-looking faces, less aggression, and very often smaller brains. Researchers Brian Hare and Richard Wrangham have argued that something similar happened to us, just without a human breeder making the choices. Their idea is that early human groups increasingly punished extreme aggression from within. A violently dominant individual was more likely to get ganged up on and removed from the group than to thrive and reproduce. Do that consistently, generation after generation, and you've got a real selection pressure, the same kind that shapes domesticated species elsewhere. Except here humans did it to themselves, through social punishment instead of a breeder's hand. And the skeletal evidence lines up in a genuinely eerie way. Human skulls do get less rugged and more juvenile looking across this window. Brow ridges shrink. Faces get shorter and softer. Some researchers connect this to lower testosterone exposure during development, echoing changes documented in animals deliberately bred for tameness. The most famous version of that comparison is a real, decades-long experiment in Siberia. Starting in 1959, geneticist Dmitry Belyaev and later his colleague Lyudmila Trut bred silver foxes for exactly one trait: calmness around humans, just tameness. Within a handful of generations, entirely new traits started showing up that nobody had selected for directly. Floppy ears, curly tails, patches of white fur, faces that stayed puppyish into adulthood. It's one of the most famous demonstrations in biology that selecting for one behavioral trait can drag a whole cluster of physical traits along with it. So naturally, everyone assumed brain size would shrink in those tame foxes too, matching the classic domestication pattern. Except when researchers actually scanned the brains of those tame foxes in detail, that's not quite what they found. The tame foxes didn't show reduced brain volume at all. If anything, certain brain regions were larger compared to ordinary farm-bred foxes. Even stranger, foxes bred for the opposite trait, heightened aggression, showed some of the same neural changes. So even the flagship experiment behind the domestication shrinks the brain idea turned out to be more complicated than the simple version everyone repeats. Selecting for tameness clearly rewires the brain. It just isn't obviously the same thing as shrinking it, which means suspect 2 isn't cleared exactly, but it's not an open and shut case either. So on to the next suspect we go. A team of researchers proposed something almost sideways to the other explanations. Maybe individual brains got smaller because human societies got smarter, not less intelligent people. Less need for any one person to carry the full cognitive load alone. Here's a way to picture it. Imagine two people, Bob and Alice, living in very different kinds of groups. Bob lives in a small, isolated band. If Bob doesn't personally know how to track an animal, treat a wound, start a fire, navigate by the stars, and remember which plants are poisonous, nobody's necessarily around to fill that gap for him. His own head has to hold almost everything his survival depends on. Alice lives generations later, in a much larger, more interconnected society, with trade routes, specialists, and shared knowledge passed between groups. Alice doesn't need to personally know how to do everything. Someone else in her network is the healer. Someone else is the toolmaker. Someone else studies the stars. Alice can lean on the network instead of carrying it all herself. The researchers behind this hypothesis leaned on an unusual comparison to make their case: ant colonies. In some ant species, individual ants actually have smaller brains than their solitary ancestors, even as the colony as a whole becomes capable of dramatically more complex coordinated behavior. When a group starts sharing information, dividing labor and specializing, no single member needs to personally hold everything in their own head. Intelligence starts living in the network as much as in any one individual. Applied to Alice's world instead of Bob's, that's a genuinely elegant idea. And then another team of researchers came along and picked the whole thing apart. A separate group went back to the same kind of fossil evidence and reached a strikingly different conclusion. No meaningful brain size reduction at all across the entire recorded history of our species. Their critique was pointed and specific. The original sample size covering the critical time window was small, just a couple dozen skulls. Those skulls were pulled from wildly different parts of the world and lumped together, as if agriculture, social complexity, and diet had all changed everywhere on Earth at exactly the same moment, which they demonstrably didn't. And if the outsourcing knowledge to complex societies idea were correct, you'd expect the timing of any brain shrinkage to differ region by region, depending on when complex societies actually showed up locally. Their reanalysis found no such regional pattern, and no statistically significant reduction at all. For a while, this looked like case closed. Verdict, myth. Except the case didn't stay closed. More recently, a much larger analysis revisited the whole question, using nearly 1,000 skulls instead of a couple dozen. And it landed on brain shrinkage again, but with a genuine plot twist. The timing wasn't 20 or 30,000 years ago at all. It pointed to something far more recent, only around 3,000 years ago, well inside recorded history, somewhere around the era of early empires and the spread of writing systems. And that same research team directly tested whether body size, diet, or self-domestication could explain the drop. According to their own analysis, none of those fully accounted for it, which quietly puts even the earlier suspects back on trial, including the very domestication idea we just spent several minutes on. So, where does that honestly leave us? Two credible research teams, two very different timelines, a genuine, ongoing, public disagreement about whether this even happened, let alone why. That's not the tidy ending I went in hoping to find, but it might be the most honest one available right now. Before this spirals into an existential crisis about your own skull, here's something worth sitting with. Even researchers who are confident the brain shrank are quick to say that doesn't mean modern humans think worse than Ice Age humans. Brain size and intelligence just aren't the same measurement. Women's brains are, on average, smaller than men's, with no corresponding gap in cognitive ability. And going back further, Neanderthals, our closest extinct relatives, actually had larger average brain volumes than modern humans do, without clear evidence that translated into greater intelligence. Some researchers argue a smaller brain could simply be a more efficient brain. Better organized wiring, doing more with less raw material, similar to how a modern processor can outperform a bulkier one built a decade earlier. So, even inside the "yes, it genuinely shrank" camp, the interesting question isn't, are we getting dumber? It's what actually changed inside the wiring, not just the outer size. And that question is still wide open. Isn't the newest study just going to get refuted too, the same way the last one was? Maybe. That's a completely fair thing to wonder, and honestly part of why this topic is worth revisiting. Science working exactly like this, with claims getting tested, challenged, and retested against bigger datasets, isn't a sign the field is broken. It's what a live, unresolved question is supposed to look like from the outside. If we self-domesticated, shouldn't that show up clearly in brain scans the way it did in the tame foxes? You'd think so, and that's exactly the problem the 2021 Fox study raised. It didn't cleanly show up the expected way, even in the textbook domestication experiment, which is a real complication for anyone treating self-domestication as a settled explanation for smaller human brains. Could this trend still be happening right now, or could it reverse? There's no strong evidence either way, and this is genuinely hard to track in real time. Confidently measuring skull trends takes centuries of accumulated data, not decades. So the next time somebody tells you with total confidence that the human brain has been shrinking for thousands of years, you now know the honest version. It might be true, it might not be. And even the researchers chasing it down keep landing on different years, different causes, and different verdicts. Maybe we didn't get smaller because we got weaker. Maybe we got smaller because, for the first time in our history, we stopped needing to carry everything alone in one skull. Or maybe we didn't get smaller at all, and we're just now organized enough as a species to keep arguing about it properly.